Well, welcome everybody to this meeting of Justice for Palestinians, Leamington Spa, or Leamington Spa tends to mean South Warwickshire these days. Very pleased to see you all, and special welcome to those of you who come from further afield. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Chris Doyle, who's the Director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding and has been for many years. Chris, his organisation also provides a secretariat for the all-party parliamentary group on Palestine. And I know, because I've heard them say so, that MPs from all the parties turn to Chris for advice on Palestine matters. So I think we will find ourselves in for a very interesting talk from him this evening, and I hope it will be followed by a lively discussion. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, John. It's a real pleasure to talk to you tonight, and at such a timely moment. In actual fact, it's more timely than we might imagine. When we first thought of this, I think it was a different date, but as it happens, the 10th of June is extremely important for what I'm about to talk about tonight, because it is actually the 54th anniversary of the end of the 1967 war, but also in the context of Jerusalem. But of course, at that time, Israeli forces captured East Jerusalem, and it's remained under occupation, but they committed perhaps their first war crime, serious war crime in Jerusalem then, by the systematic, deliberate demolition of the Moroccan Quarter in the Old City, where over 600 Palestinians were evicted from that area to make way for what became the plaza in front of the Wailing Wall. So it is actually, in terms of the date, very timely. The other thing, which is merely coincidental, is that I put in the title "Setting Fire to Jerusalem," and little was I to know that there is this huge forest fire that is going on right now in the hills just to the north of Jerusalem. So, it's actually even happening on the ground at, one of these great forest fires. I think it's now under control. But the timing, of course, is most important because of what has happened, particularly over the last couple of months. And a lot of people think that, I'm sure not you, because you're highly involved in Palestinian issues, that it started with the rockets coming out of Gaza. Of course it didn't. It started in Jerusalem in Ramadan. And you cannot imagine a more tense place during Ramadan if relations between Israelis and Palestinians are at a low point. And I remember seeing a short video of some settlers in the Muslim quarter of the Old City, right in the middle of the day, so when Muslims are fasting, lighting up a barbecue in one of the narrow, crowded streets of that wonderful part of the city. I mean, this is how they sort of greeted, to be deliberately provocative to Palestinians who are fasting in what is for them a blessed month. Now, imagine if it was the other way and it was during Passover and Palestinians were attempting to provoke Jewish citizens in the same sort of way. And what we saw then was a gradual ramping up of actions by the Israeli authorities, Israeli police harassment. We saw the closing off of the Damascus Gate, which is the entrance, the primary entrance into the Muslim quarter, which is the largest quarter of the Old City, to Palestinian Muslims. They couldn't stand out there and mingle out there as they normally would after prayer, which is a tradition in Ramadan. We saw also that they cut off the loudspeakers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they restricted entry of Palestinians from the West Bank to very, very low levels. Now, some of that is explained, of course, because of COVID, but it's the sort of thing that when you see that, and it wasn't necessarily always being applied to Israeli Jewish citizens. But Jerusalem is the heart, the volcanic core of this conflict, and where you see all sorts of key issues being played out. You see in terms of territory, in terms of refugees, land, displacement. It all happens in Jerusalem, but in a city that, of course, which has great resonance globally to the adherents of the three monotheistic faiths, to people across the world who are attached to its history and its symbolic meaning. Wars have started here. And in the more recent history, of course, we've seen intifadas starting here. The second intifada started here. We've seen various massacres. You go back to 1990. We've seen even the minaret of Al-Aqsa being burnt down in 1969. I mean, it is extremely delicate. The most recent case before 2021 really was in 2014. And it was events in Jerusalem that then led to the escalation in the conflict with Gaza. And people forget that. And it's amazing, in fact, if you look at it quite carefully, how events in 2014 were replicated this year, not too dissimilar fashion, in fact. Now, I think one of the biggest things that has changed is that we have at the moment, or at least until Sunday, one assumes, given the vote that will happen in the Knesset, that the Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, has at times had it in his interest not to set Jerusalem alight. But this was no longer the case. He, of course, is facing corruption charges. He's fighting for his political life. He may be in court in, is it case 4000, I think they're calling it. And he wanted to escalate. It was in his interest to escalate, and he certainly did. Now, I'm not saying that he personally commanded various supporters, the Kahanis, to go on those death to Arab marches that we saw going through East Jerusalem and the other provocative actions. But he certainly didn't say anything about it. He didn't criticize it. He didn't say anything about the deputy mayor of Jerusalem when he talked about the fact that Abu Hummus, this Palestinian in Sheikh Jarrah, who had been shot in the hip, should have been shot in the forehead. Where was the responsible leadership here to calm things down? It didn't exist. He didn't want it. And arguably this week, he is even less interested in trying to cool matters. So he was the arsonist in chief, who is certainly creating the atmosphere that was leading to these huge tensions. Now, we saw that he introduced, as I said, I think only 10,000 people were allowed in from the West Bank into Jerusalem. But this had sort of happened before, and we had seen attempts to change the status quo on the Temple Mount. On the first Friday in Ramadan, only 70,000 Muslims were able to pray on Al-Aqsa, which is a very small number for a Friday in Ramadan. And it certainly challenges Israel's, well, the hollow claim to allow freedom of worship in the city. So this was the backdrop. This is where it all kicked off, just to remind you of that. So we have this very highly combustible city in the world's most combustible city, a situation in the world's most combustible city. And they knew that it could lead to this dangerous explosion. 3 bonfires, essentially, if I can call them that, were lit. And the first, and perhaps most dangerous, so I'll take it first, is that for some time now, under Netanyahu, Israel has been tearing up the delicate status quo that governs the holy places in Jerusalem, and in particular the Haram al-Sharif or Temple Mount complex. So this is very challenging. Since 1967, these understandings that were then also put into the peace treaty with Jordan saw that on the platform of the Haram al-Sharif, that would be under the control of the Islamic Waqf, under the ultimate authority of the Jordanians, that Jewish authorities would have control of the Wailing Wall and that complex, and of course Christian communities would be in control of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other Christian sites. But Israel has been allowing more and more Jews to pray on the platform very openly. They boast about it, they air it on YouTube, and they include some of the most racist of Israelis, Kahanists, and including the newly elected member of the Knesset, Itamar Ben-Gvir. And just to remind you that the Kahanists who got elected did so because Netanyahu actively courted them to campaign and to be part of his potential coalition. He managed to get them into a coalition, and he managed therefore to secure all those votes for his bloc. The status quo arrangements for the holy sites do not permit Jewish prayer on the platform. Let's be very clear about this. It's been acknowledged in the past even by Netanyahu himself. So it's exclusively a Muslim place of worship. And that's something that every Israeli leader since the occupation has begun has accepted. So what Palestinian Muslims fear is the Hebronization of the Haram Sharif. Now, you will all know that in 1994, there was the Hebron massacre in the Ibrahimi Mosque. And since then, what we have seen is the expanding of the Jewish synagogue area of the mosque at the expense of the Muslim area, and that actually it was Palestinians who were punished ultimately for the massacre that was carried out by an Israeli settler, Baruch Goldstein. And they fear that the Haram Sharif will at some point be divided, that access will be limited to certain hours, there'll be a synagogue set up, etc., etc. And of course, there are these extremist groups who have plans and have models about rebuilding the temple and so forth. So tampering with the status quo in Jerusalem is extremely serious. And what made it this time around so grave was that there was no external intervention to calm things down. We'd seen in the past, one may recall John Kerry, when he was US Secretary of State, immediately working the phones and engaging in diplomacy, something that we hardly experienced in the 4 years of the Trump administration, to calm things down, to work an arrangement between the Israeli and Jordanian leadership. That was not possible. There was no one to do it. We had a Biden administration that had barely taken office. But also, we have seen in the last few years a real and pretty serious decline in relations between Netanyahu and Abdullah of Jordan. They're barely on speaking terms, and tensions have rarely been higher. So that also made it more flammable. So the situation at Al-Aqsa has not been resolved at all. And we are still seeing attempts of Jewish prayer by these extremists. And that is important. It's not just Jews going there to pray, but it is extremists who have a publicly stated agenda of wanting to take over the Haram Sharif, the platform. Bonfire number 2 is perhaps is the serious attempt to bring about mass evictions in Palestinians in key areas of Jerusalem, notably Sheikh Jarrah. Now, why is this different before? Well, if we look back really at the history of the Israeli occupation of East Jerusalem that started back on the 10th of June 1967, and when Israel annexed 70 square kilometers effectively of the West Bank, the population in East Jerusalem then was entirely Palestinian, about 69,000. Today, it's just over 350,000. We have seen 220,000 settlers being put into East Jerusalem, nearly all of them in 13 settlements, all bar about 3,000. Now, in order to do that, with the exception of the Moroccan Quarter, by and large, Israel did not have to engage in any active displacement of Palestinians. What it did take was a lot of the public land, that these settlements were built on public land. Of course, public land could be for the benefit of the community, but it shouldn't be, of course, for the sole benefit of one segment of that community, and deliberately in terms of this, the Israeli Jews, and of course for settlers. They're illegal. It is occupied territory. So we saw this process, and it's only now that we are seeing in Sheikh Jarrah, in these areas I'll come to, a process of forcible eviction that is not just about the 4 families that are actually in court and waiting to get a Supreme Court judgment coming up. It is much more that. It's the thin edge of the wedge, and it's really about a fight for the Palestinian existence in and around the old city, in and around the Holy Basin. So what we are seeing is that they are now deploying the legal system to enable Israeli Jews to kick out Palestinians in certain areas, particularly in Sheikh Jarrah, and they do it in a particular way. I'm not going to go into all the details, you probably know it, but essentially these Palestinians under threat in Sheikh Jarrah are actually UN refugees. They were settled there by the Jordanians after 1948 into an area that had historically, going back to Ottoman times, been Jewish. They were given permission to live there. They lived in houses that nobody else has ever lived in. And basically, Israeli settler organizations with the entire backing, this is state sanctioned, have been attempting to take this over. So when we look at it, they use 2 laws which expose really the racist laws, to be quite honest, if you take them together. The Absentee Property Law of 1950 and the Legal and Administrative Matters Law of 1970. Now, the 1950 laws prohibits Palestinians from reclaiming their properties lost in that 1947-49 war. The 1970 law permits Israeli Jews to reclaim properties that were lost in that same law. So in other words, Israeli Jews could claim properties that had been lost, in that war, but Palestinians couldn't. Now, the settlers took the title from the families, etc., who had been there, and therefore pursued a process through the courts to evict these Palestinians. The Palestinians, one of their primary arguments is, fine, if you want to claim this historic title, but we want to be able to claim our historical title to our properties within Israel, whether it's in Jaffa, Haifa, Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, etc. Of course, that hasn't been permitted. And this is why it's not some mundane real estate issue. And it's not just 4 families, it's many, many more. So the situation at the moment is that the Attorney General has basically washed his hands of it. He's informed the Supreme Court that he will not intervene in the forced displacement. Now, I'm just going to show you some maps to slightly break up my talk here, just to give you a sense of, excuse me one moment, hopefully you can all see this, what we are looking at. And I'm going to skip that bit. Here we go. So these are UN maps, and we're looking solely at East Jerusalem, and you can see there in the blue outline that is occupied East Jerusalem, and the yellow block is the old city. Now, just to sort of remind you, these are, the Palestinian areas in the brown, and you see that in the drawing of lines back in 1967, that they attempted to take as much land with as few villages as possible. So many of them actually lay outside those boundaries. Let's have a look at the Sheikh Jarrah map. Now, there's 2 main areas in Sheikh Jarrah that are affected. One on the left there, which is quite close to the green line, which is just north of the OCHA office, for those who've been there, is the Harun area. That's a smaller area that is affected. And the other one where we have seen all these protests is here in outside the tomb of Simon the Righteous, Shimon Hatzik, where there had been a quite a popular festival at one time for Jews at that place. And it's therefore some of these religious nationalist settlers who've been involved in trying to take over these properties. But there is also a religious motivation. And you would have seen the efforts of the Al-Kurd family in particular. And I remember, actually, just to show you how long it's going on, and John knows this, I went there with Ed Davey back in 2008, and we met a member of the Al-Kurd family, this old woman who had been at that time evicted from her house. So don't think this was the start of the process, what we've seen in 2021. And we saw her, and she was in a tent opposite her house, which was now occupied by settlers. We had a very difficult chat with her about what had happened and expressed our sympathies and support and solidarity and the like, as you might expect. We left, we were halfway to Bethlehem, and we got a call that the Israelis had moved in and demolished the tent. We did go back and try to talk to her, but it wasn't until the next day, and we saw the newspapers, Palestinian newspapers, that we saw this great big bulldozer doing it. I mean, you know, you think with a tent you could just sort of take it down quite easily, but no, they did it in a dramatic style. And yet again, you know, it's very clear here that the authorities are very much part of this process of settlement in Sheikh Jarrah. So this is to the north of the old city, and they are attempting to, if I go back now and show you the other area, which is somewhat to the south, where I think actually it affects a much larger number of people. I think it's about 300 Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah will be affected. It's much larger in this area, in the area of Silwan, Batan al-Hawa and al-Bustan. Now, this actually, is they're more liable, not so much for evictions. There are cases of evictions, but for demolitions. And actually, even recently, we've had families who have been given demolition orders, told that unless they do the demolition themselves, and this is so cynical, that the municipality will come in and do it for them, and they will have to pay the municipality. And it's very serious. And Elad, this settlement group, is creating this sort of City of David theme park going there that comes down from the old city to the area with tunnels and the like, with huge investments, or particularly from the Americans. And indeed, I think, if I'm right, I think it may be where Roman Abramovich has invested as well, but somebody might correct me on that one. The owner of Chelsea Football Club. So this will be very, very serious as well. And many of these people actually who live in this area actually did originate from the Moroccan quarter that we mentioned earlier. So this is, you know, although a lot of the tensions weren't over Silwan in April, it certainly will be. And of course, there have been scenes that I've seen demolitions in Silwan as well. It's overcrowded. It is not like Sheikh Jarrah, which is a very middle class area. I mean, it's certainly where, you know, richer Palestinians have lived. I'm not talking about the Al-Kurd family, but generally it is. So let me just come back. Sorry, excuse me. And what the, you know, this is not all, to be honest, part of this is all part of a plan in the old, which includes cable cars. It includes a whole lot, almost a Disneyfication of the area around the old city, the Mount of Olives, you know, Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, a takeover. Now, this takeover, and we talk about Jerusalem, is not happening, you know, up in Beit Hanina, or it's not happening in Beit Safafa. It is deliberately around that holy basin in what's the Kidron Valley, and it is therefore to de-Palestinianize that area. And it's really important. And that is why it is not some mundane real estate issue. It is a major real estate issue, if you like. It is forcible eviction, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from that area. And I think it's perfectly acceptable and justified to use that term. I don't use it lightly, but these are the plans, and it goes much further. Just to remind you, because I think it is, you know, if you go to the east, you have the E1 plan. This is on the boundaries. This is within what we call, you know, Greater Jerusalem, as the Israelis will call it, which would divide Jerusalem from much of the West Bank, divide the West Bank, north and south, would see the displacement. I think, if I recall, sometimes it's like, I think something like 12,000 Bedouins in that area. That is another example of ethnic cleansing in the pipeline. Communities, Khan al-Ahmar is very famous because a lot of ministers, I've taken a lot of MPs there over the years, and Miliband went, but foreign secretaries have been, and so forth. That, you know, those communities will be moved off. We were in many ways quite fortunate that that did not happen during the Trump administration, because there's no way that Trump would have objected. And I'm quite sure a lot of the settlers, you know, will be kicking themselves for not having taken advantage of it. But so that process around Jerusalem is to remind you that the big settlement plans, both within you know, East Jerusalem and the outside, the periphery of it, are very advanced. And to the south, there is the settlement of Givat Hamatos, which serves a similar purpose that separates off Jerusalem from Bethlehem. It finishes that curtain of settlements that completely decouples the two cities, which are, of course, so close to each other. So just to give you a little idea of these plans, to give you the Disneyfication of it all, and you see here the archaeological park, the City of David, another one. I mean, you've got the Peace Forest, etc. I mean, the whole thing, you know, archaeological experience. So this is all about creating a great tourist site of the ancient Jerusalem. The ancient Jerusalem, of course, they will be pushing the Jewish historical narrative, but without the reference to all the other civilizations and peoples who have lived in Jerusalem over the history. Of course, there is a very significant Jewish attachment to the city and part of its history, but it shouldn't be pushed as an exclusive narrative. I'm going to stop the share there and come very quickly to, because I must wrap up for questions, the final thing, and that really was something else, which I do think did play a role in Jerusalem in what has happened, because it was the decision of the Israeli authorities that there would be no Palestinian elections in East Jerusalem, that there would be no campaigning, no voting going on there, which in part at least explains why President Abbas decided to delay the elections. I do believe that he was looking for any excuse, but this Israeli decision certainly provided it. The Palestinians are right to argue that why should Palestinians living in occupied Palestinian territory that should be part of one territorial unit, as under Oslo, and as it actually lays out in those Oslo Accords, that they are allowed to vote, as they did in '96, as they did in 2005 and 2006, that they should be allowed to again. And I think it was very clear. I don't think it's a hidden reason. The head of Shin Bet went to Mahmoud Abbas and said, you must not have these elections. Israel opposed these elections right from the start. It feared, of course, that the elections would allow Hamas into power, into some form of coalition government. But it was obviously, you know, direct interference in what was going on. And by doing that, I think it removed within Palestinian politics, at least, a way forward. What was next? And what we have seen, and I'm going to try and finish on a positive point, is that actually Palestinian civil society, young Palestinians have got together and they've done terrific work in Sheikh Jarrah to oppose what's going on. Many of them have been arrested. A large campaign of arrests have gone on in Jerusalem, but also elsewhere in Israel. the figures from the Israeli police are out. I think over 2,000 have been arrested since about May the 10th. And actually, I think this has inspired many Palestinians, including Palestinian citizens of Israel, by the way. And it's one of the reasons why people talk about a unity intifada, an intifada of Palestinian unity. And it was in many ways attracting huge amounts of attention to an issue that otherwise hadn't got it. By the time we came around to what happened over Gaza on the 10th of May. Jerusalem, though, today is far from calm. These young, bright activists are very much there. They are not going to give up. There's been no de-escalation. And I would argue already the international community has dropped the baton. It's no longer paying it the attention it was even a week ago. So we are likely to see, with the determination of these young Palestinians, this issue to be in the news before too long. And until such time as Israel decides to, or is compelled to, drop these plans for evictions and demolitions. I'll leave it there. I hope that's kicked off and there's enough for discussion and so forth. Can't hear you, John.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Chris. If anybody's got any questions or any comments they'd like to make, would they please indicate in the chat that they would like to do so? Or if you go to the participant list and look down to the bottom, you should see a button which you can press to signify that you'd like to ask a question. I will keep an eye on that. While you're just thinking about any question you might like to ask, let me just ask one thing, Chris. I've noticed that in the last few days, the last 2 weeks anyway, that we've had 4 leading Republicans visiting Jerusalem following the recent conflict. Nikki Haley, the former ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Pompeo, Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz. Now, 3 of those are people who might regard themselves as potential candidates for the presidency if Trump doesn't stand next time. What's all this about? What are they trying to do by visiting Jerusalem at this sensitive time?
Well, I think that's a very, very good question. There was also a very significant leader of the evangelical movement that backs Israel visiting as well. And I think I think firstly, a lot of them hadn't been doing many trips for some time. As you said, I think, people, like Nikki Haley obviously have an ambition to run for the presidency. Nobody could be sure that Trump will run again in 2024. So they are positioning themselves, but also that they actually can sort of burnish their own credentials, not least with that evangelical community, to be able to say that I'm with you, that I went there to show solidarity, and so forth. So I think it's really all about that. It's certainly not to go there to, try to persuade leading Israeli figures that they have to find a new way to deal with this, to bring the occupation to an end, or a viable negotiating process, or anything like that. That is for certain. Mike Pompeo never did that when he was in office. Nikki Haley showed no sign of being interested in that either. So I think it's all about, underlying their, pro-Israel credentials, back to the home base. Very domestic visit.
Mm-hmm. So Hilary Terrell, you've got a question. Would you like to raise it?
Oh, thank you, John. Yes, I've been a bit overwhelmed by the last few weeks. I wondered if you've got any comments about the debate that will take place on Monday at Westminster, which is in response to the petition which grew so quickly during the violence, which is something like that the UK government should apply sanctions on Israel. Now, that got 380,000 signatures in just a few days. I've seen the government response, which is laying it on thick about Israel being such a good friend of the UK. I wonder if you've got comments for us and possibly any action suggestions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Hilary. And it's a very relevant question. I mean, the government laid out a response. It wasn't a surprise. It is a reiteration of a position they've had for a long time, that they're opposed to any form of sanctions. They're opposed to BDS, and they don't believe that that is the way to go forward with Israel. Now, I find that problematic from several points of view. One is that you actually say that you're never going to do this, and no matter what. Well, you know, which country gets that sort of you know, sign off? It doesn't matter whether you commit mass force evictions or if you decide to annex large parts of occupied territory in contravention of international law, we're not going to apply sanctions. And I think that that is deeply problematic. You should always keep, you know, the issue of sanctions up your sleeve as a foreign policy instrument. I confess, though, that I mean, I don't want to be, I mean, I think there are definitely sanctions that should be imposed in terms of the arms trade. I don't think that, I think Israel's behavior on that front in terms of what it's done in Gaza definitely merits a review of the arms trade with Israel. We have campaigned heavily on the issue of settlement products and services, but I'm going to put a very, very important caveat to this. We do not believe that that is sanctions on Israel for several reasons. Firstly, that this is not part of Israel. We are not dealing settlements outside the internationally recognized sovereign state of Israel. They're not Israeli products. They're not Israeli services. That's one. But perhaps more importantly, we're not calling for sanctions here. We are calling for the implementation of international law, that you actually don't permit trade with entities, businesses operating out of an illegal entity. You know, that is actually allowing an illicit activity and allowing it to flourish. So it actually is a logical follow-on. When we say settlements are illegal about 50 times a year, if you listen to Foreign Office ministers, etc., and they express concern, grave concern, etc., in their opposition, that it's against peace, that it's illegal, that therefore you shouldn't be trading in it. It's like conflict diamonds or whatever. We should not be trading in settlement products. It's not a sanction. It's actually saying these are banned products. It's a ban we are looking for here. Now, then there is the issue is like, do you take sanctions further? I would be wary of that. I think arms sanctions and settlement products will be certainly, to start off with, one. Well, I mean, it's not going to happen. The government is not going to do it. I think we all know that. But that would be a significant step forward. I think the European Union has the option to suspend its association agreement, and we could also suspend preferential trade, you know, with Israel as well. And I think that we shouldn't be scared, as we are, the government is scared of using these tools. I do not, though, on the other hand, believe that broad brush sanctions at this stage, let's say against Israeli football teams or orchestra, are the way forward. I think that could antagonize. I think those are, you know, not helpful. We don't want to get into a situation of, you know, putting an entirety of Israeli society off, etc. It needs to be, I think, very targeted and specific. What actions that we take place. Of course, certain things can be escalated. But of course, all of it is about, we should have very clear aims as to what the sanctions are about. It is about trying to bring Israel into adherence with its international legal obligations. And, you know, that's very important. You know, but I've always been skeptical about sanctions against, you know, Iran and Syria, Libya in the past, because I think after a while sanctions lose their ability to change the behavior of those regimes. So I think this also has to be borne in mind, that we're not here just to it's not about punishing Israel. It is about trying to influence behavior. It is about, how do we get the Israelis to understand they have to end that occupation, and that any solution needs that. And when I say the occupation, I'm not saying that that necessarily means it's going to be two states. I'm talking about a rights-based solution. It's not for me to determine whether it's one state or two states, but that occupation has to end as a precursor to bringing about a lasting solution.
Presumably you would support banning the sale of Bamford excavators to
Totally.
to Israel, which are being used to further the settlement cause and demolish Palestinian properties.
I think that any business that is involved in providing products, services that allow the occupation to continue, and so that should not be permissible. We had at times, G4S being involved, etc., in the transfer of detainees, Palestinian detainees, into Israel out of occupied territory, itself a war crime. Yeah. And the government should be spelling it out. I think we haven't mentioned this yet, but they should be backing the ICC investigation and what's going on into all sides. Palestinian and Israeli, whoever is perpetrating crimes, etc., should be held accountable. And our failure to do so is one of the reasons why we are in the mess we are now, because far too many people continue to get away with it day after day.
Linda, you had a question.
Yeah, just a couple of comments first, Chris. Apparently, after we'd fixed the date to hear from you, Combatants for Peace decided to have a webinar on Sheikh Jarrah, which began at 6:30. So a number of people who were watching have had to go after that. So Sue Crossfield is one of them. She sends her regards. You were talking about Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, both which I visited. Oh, yeah. I was very struck by, Sue's still here. When I was in Silwan, watching a group of, I don't know if they were Jewish settlers, but Orthodox Jews, walking through Albistan, escorted by armed soldiers, and they were literally just eyeing up the real estate. I mean, it was completely surreal watching them choose other people's homes. But my question is actually a bit different. It's about the, I'm just looking at it now, the element in the Queen's speech about BDS.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it's actually, it doesn't mention Israel, but the title of the element in the Queen's speech, it's page 151 of the stuff, it's not what she said, it's actually the thing that's tabled by the government, is BDS. And it says that the aim of the legislation is to stop public bodies from taking a different approach to UK government sanctions and foreign relations. And we know what's behind this. What sort of campaigning is there likely to be against this? Can you give us any advice? What can we do?
Yeah, this isn't the first time that it was raised. Yeah. So it's reappeared, and it's I think it's very dangerous. And the first thing I would say about BDS is that it exists because the international community has failed to carry out its obligation. It exists because the British government has failed to ensure that Israel adheres to its legal obligations. And that is why individual members of the public and groups have decided to go for boycott, divestment and sanctions as something they can do of their own volition to express their outrage and to disassociate themselves with what's going on. Now, if the British government was to press meaningfully with consequences for Israel to adhere by international law, with its allies, with its partners, BDS wouldn't exist. It would be entirely different. So the reason it's there because of an historic international failure. Now, of course, yes, the government wishes now to control, to stop these local authorities from doing this, to divesting pension funds, etc. I think it's going to run into a lot of opposition, not least from unions as well as councils. But the difference now between when they first raised it is, of course, the Conservatives have a majority of 80. And I think if there was a vote in Parliament, I think they would vote with the whip, bar a couple. And so they will be able to push the legislation through. Now, it may be challenged, maybe judicial review, and so forth. But I think it's a novel approach to say that the British government's foreign policy has to somehow, be followed by, local councils all over the country. I think that is, and you're absolutely right. It is done specifically on the issue of Israel. I would also, and I should have said this earlier, it's also very noticeable the differing ways in they've dealt with different situations. And I would take the Crimea. The government imposed, along with the EU, sanctions when Russia went and occupied Crimea. Very quickly, overnight, no hesitation. And it's exactly the same, legal system. We should be absolutely as robust about the Israeli occupation of the lands it took in 1967 as we are and remain about Russia's occupation of the Crimea. And, it's about an international rules-based system. The government pays lip service to it, but, Israel is one example where it highlights the hypocrisy, the lack of consistency in application. Saudi Arabia would be another. There are other countries as well who just consistently are able to get away with it, who operate outside of these norms of international law.
Gian, Claire, you had a question. We're not hearing you, Gian. You're not muted, but we're not hearing you.
Right, okay.
Good.
How realistic is the formation of the new government? And if Netanyahu is defeated, what effect, if any, will this have on the current Israeli policies towards the Palestinians?
It's a really, really very good question. So, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the Speaker of the Knesset is a member of Netanyahu's own party. And it's clearly made the vote on Sunday to give them the maximum amount of time, particularly with Shabbat as well. So they declare who would be in the coalition government, I think, tomorrow, and then Netanyahu will do his utmost to try to unpick it. And of course, it's an extraordinary coalition of bedfellows. I mean, you all know this. I mean, extreme far right, people like Naftali Bennett, who in many ways are to the right of Netanyahu, to, Labour and Meretz, and of course, an Islamist party in Iran. I mean, I don't think even the most veteran of Israeli observers would ever have imagined that something will come together like this, but they are bound together by a desire to put an end to the Netanyahu era that's lasted since 2009. They will also, and I increasingly come to the view, they'll be bound together by another thing, the realization that they've got to make this work. I wasn't convinced about that at first, but for varying reasons. First of all, Naftali Bennett is in a curious situation. He will be the prime minister if it all goes with the vote. He won, under 7% of the vote in the last elections in March. That's an extraordinary situation for somebody to be prime minister in that sort of, scenario. So he must be thinking, this might be my one and only chance. This will be my moment in the spotlight to carry out, what he aims to do, to demonstrate that he has the capabilities to be the leader of the Israeli far right. And here we'll be eyeing up the part of Likud is not totally wedded to Netanyahu. I mean, Netanyahu has a following in parts of Likud, but there's another part of it that is willing to consider a different leadership. So if Bennett can demonstrate that actually he's the solution, the curious thing is that the far right bloc won 70 out of 120 seats, I think it is, in the Knesset. They have an inbuilt majority. In all of these Israeli elections we've had, the one consistent thing is largely Israelis have voted right. They're different parties, but they can't get along with each other because of Netanyahu. So if he gets rid of Netanyahu, he's voted out, but then goes to court, and I'm sure many of them are hoping he goes to jail, etc., and he's off the scene. Maybe Likud kick him out. Bennett will be aiming to take over. But then you have the other parties. I mean, when are Labour and Meretz ever going to be in coalition again? I mean, the Labour Party is in historic decline. It's barely relevant. It's hardly wins any seats. So, that is, clearly very difficult. Meretz, yet again, it hasn't been in government for, since the 1990s. And, an Arab party, the Palestinian party of Iran, yet again, and actually recent events have made it very hard for them, because Mansour Abbas, who leads the party, his general pitch was, we're going in for budgets. We're going to go in to get policing. We're going to get, that's what, we're not going to pursue Palestinian national interests, because that's not going to get us anywhere. But then between the election and now, of course, we've seen what's happened. And the zeitgeist amongst Palestinian citizens of Israel, is, unity and working together on national issues. So he's now completely, he's lost so much popularity. So if it goes to another election, it's not clear how much support that he would get. So most of them actually are better off trying to hang into a coalition to keep it going, give enough time to get rid of Netanyahu, get him into court, give enough time to get everybody past this current moment. But it will be very difficult. It's a 61 out of 120. The Netanyahu only has to shift one person. He only has to bribe, cajole, persuade, threaten successfully, and it all falls apart, and we go into another election. So yeah, watch this space. It's very, very valid.
In terms of how it might affect current Israeli policies,
I don't think it's going to affect them hugely. Mainly, they've all come in as sort of, I think it doesn't have a great agenda to change existing policies. So it's all part of the coalition agreement. So there's not going to be some massive change. It doesn't have a mandate, for example, to enter into serious negotiations. It doesn't have a mandate to annex large parts of the West Bank. So I think what will matter a great deal is who are the individual ministers. Ayelet Shaked is probably the most extreme of a lot of them, is going to be the interior minister. And that has implications for Palestinians, not least in East Jerusalem. I think that, we'll see some turf warfare between some of the ministers, etc. But I think we will see essentially the status quo remain in terms of how to deal with the Palestinians. And remember, and this is so important, that for most Israelis, the future of their issues with the Palestinians, is not their main concern. It's not even their second or third or fourth. The only time it becomes their main concern is when there is a conflagration, as we saw over Gaza. And this is a major problem. How do you actually convince Israelis that they are, sitting on the edge of this volcano, as Danny Seidemann talks about it, and that the military cannot always protect them from, the consequences of maintaining this occupation, because there will be a flare-up, and this conflict will hit them in one way or another. We don't want to see that. That's the last thing, of course. But if you leave the occupation intact, if you leave the settlements expanding and the demolitions going forward, then there is going to be reaction, and we are going to see bloodshed. And that's the worrying thing. At what point does Israeli political classes genuinely realize that they have to make the historical deal, the historical painful decision? And I'm not sure they're there yet.
So back in the 1980s, nobody really expected apartheid to come to an end in South Africa. Nobody really expected the collapse of the Berlin Wall or anticipated the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I've heard people say that, the Israel-Palestinian thing will happen when people don't expect it. But when you think about de Klerk in South Africa, de Klerk was one of the leading figures in the Afrikaans government, committed all his life to apartheid. But within 2 years of being appointed their leader, he realized that the game was up and started the process of releasing Mandela from jail and the elections that followed and so on and so forth. What would it take, for Bennett to have his de Klerk moment and realize that he had got to lead Israel down a different path?
I'm not sure it's going to be Bennett. I'm not sure the makeup of the man, you know, but I'd love to be proved wrong. You know, allows for a de Klerk moment from him. I mean, it needs leadership. It needs a statesman. Netanyahu was never that. He was a tactician. He is a masterful political operator, but he's not a statesman. And, you know, it's actually a difference between him and Ariel Sharon. Now, I don't have any time for Sharon's policies, but Sharon, I think, was far more interested in what is historical legacy. He had a strategy. He wasn't so good at all the party maneuverings, but he always had a vision of what he wanted to achieve, you know, of course, with his military background. And I think Netanyahu is just about staying in power, really. And I think that, you know, he would be prepared to make deals as he did over Hebron in 97, if it suited his immediate needs. Whereas somebody like Sharon would not do that. He did Gaza in 2005 because it was in his interest, because he saw it was giving up Gaza to get the West Bank. I'm not sure Naftali Bennett is the person. Now, that's not to say there aren't other people currently in Israeli politics who could have, you know, that sort of de Klerk moment. But I think they would also need to have a groundswell of people behind them. I don't think that exists. I think, on the other hand, there isn't also a Palestinian Mandela at the moment. And, you know, I think there's quite a lot of criticisms of the Palestinian leadership, both Fatah, PLO, and of Hamas, certainly Hamas, but also, you know, what is the strategy of Mahmoud Abbas? I mean, he's in his mid-80s now. Where is he taking Palestinians? What is the future? And that is why you're seeing these young Palestinians in Jerusalem, you know, speaking out. I think the seeds of something very different. And it's increasingly sidelining these, you know, decaying leaderships who really, for most of Palestinians, I think, in the occupied territories, now have very little meaning. So I think it needs change on the Palestinian side as well as the Israeli, and it needs a change also in the international community. And maybe we're getting there a little bit. Another uplifting thing, perhaps, is that the American scene has changed. The conversation in the United States has definitely changed. Bit by bit, we're getting articles from Palestinians. They're not so deplatformed as they were. There are Democrats who are speaking up in the way that hadn't happened in the past. So there is Biden, maybe the first president in a long time, who actually feels a bit of political pressure. Not enough to shift him, I would argue, to take up serious action, but enough to make him somewhat aware of it. And that's a change. And if that sort of process continues, and we saw actually very interesting opinion polls, you know, in various European countries, in the way in which the recent conflagration, flare up, whatever we wish to call it, had affected European opinion, including in Britain, massive drop in the public's support for Israel and what it was up to. And I think, you know, that is, in the long term, a very serious issue for the state of Israel. And that, you know, interestingly, Naftali Bennett actually comes from, you know, he actually ran a campaign several elections back where he talked about his, was it comfort solution? And that was basically, I mean, this is going back, I think, about 10 years ago. You know, we should just annex the West Bank and relax about Europe. They're not going to impose sanctions. Don't get worried about it. This is something that Shimon Peres and Zippy Livni get worried about. But actually, look, they make a lot of noise, but they don't do anything. We can just take the West Bank. I mean, that was his, you know, his relaxation solution. So if he wishes to go down that path, what sort of reaction does the international community come? Do we get to sanctions that were mentioned? Who knows?
I see that Richard Dixon has a question about Sven Koopmans, who's been appointed as the EU representative in the Middle East. Do you know anything about him? And
I don't, in fact. I mean, the trouble with the EU at the moment, and that this, in contrast to what I've said about the United States, I think actually the EU is headed, unfortunately, in a different direction. And that is because of the splits in EU that got worse and worse. And we see the Netanyahu was very good at cozying up, particularly to Hungary, to many of the Eastern European states, Poland, the Czech Republic, Greece. And it means that increasingly we don't have a common EU policy. Increasingly, we've seen very strange statements from about 10 or 11 EU states on what's been going on. They're largely Western European states, countries like Ireland and Sweden and France, Spain, Italy. And if you don't have a common EU policy, then that will make our challenge much greater. So I think whilst, for example, Viktor Orban is still in power in Hungary, of course, he seems to be welcome in Downing Street despite his anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim language and rhetoric and actions. Then I think we have a problem in terms of the EU.
Okay, well, I think we better, thank you very much, Chris. I think we better draw it to a close there, as we've had slightly over our hour, and we're most grateful to you for spending time with us. I think it's been a very stimulating talk and good discussion that's followed. Thank you very
much, and do get in touch. I mean, my email is on the website, but it's I can put it in the chat right now. And you know, if you got any questions or anything, you know, do put that in there. Do get in touch, sign up to our email list, and we do have various events, of course. You're all welcome to come and join our online briefings.
And at least a couple of us I know are members of CAABU, and I would strongly encourage others to think about doing so. They do have a very good program and do really worthwhile things. Can I just mention before we finish two things? One is that most of you will know that we've been having fairly regular vigils outside the town hall on Saturday mornings during the recent war. It was each Saturday. We've now gone back to once a month, and the next one is going to be on Saturday the 19th from 11 till 12. So do please come and join us if you can. And in terms of future meetings, we've already sent out a note asking you to just mark the date for the 1st of August. Dr. Brian Klug is going to come and talk to us about the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which he thinks is preferable to the IHRA one. And that we are planning as a physical meeting. Of course, it does depend a bit on what the government decides about easing up lockdown, but we are hoping that that will be the first of physical meetings again. And on that note, I think I will draw things to a close. Thank you very much all for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chris and John.
John? He's gone.
Go ahead, Jan. Did you want to ask something, Jan?
I just wanted to plug the meeting for next Tuesday.
Well, go ahead. You got 8 people still online.
I mean, you got my notice, haven't you? If you could circulate it.
We will send that round. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
It's a follow-on to what been discussed this evening.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll do that. Jan, thanks very much.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Good night all.